Parking garages don't have weather. They have echoes. When Ranger sat without making a sound, Lena knew the men ahead were wired tight enough to kill. Then, Emma's glucose monitor flashed one wild number and died. Somewhere below concrete and titanium, her daughter was running out of sugar, air, and time. Water dripped again, slow and hollow, and the sound crossed the garage and came back thin, clipped, wrong. Lena stopped halfway down the ramp with Ranger tight against her left leg and let the place show its shape, one piece at a time. She saw concrete pillars, an oil sheen, a contractor van with no plates, and sodium lamps buzzing behind wire cages. Damp cement and old motor oil sat heavy in the air, with a rusty tang under it that made her think of instruments left wet too long. Ranger did not bark. He never did when it counted. His damaged right ear twitched on reflex, while the left stayed forward, hunting. He licked the edge of his jaw and tapped one nail twice against the floor. That was enough. Lena lowered her center of gravity and let her eyes work the blind angles. Ranger stayed seated, rigid now, with his muzzle set on a column 30 feet ahead. She slid the folded Mylar rescue blanket free from her kit without looking down. The foil felt light and stupid in her hand. Good. Stupid things were useful when armed men were wearing expensive optics. Her phone screen had already gone black where Emma's number should have been, and there was no trend line, no arrow, and no mercy in the data. She pocketed it and listened. A shoe brushed concrete, fabric whispered. There was more than one man ahead of her, with one close enough to take the shot and another holding back. She caught the first shape in a windshield reflection before he stepped out for real. He wore a helmet and held a suppressed pistol with night optics pulled low over his face. He saw only a woman in a dark jacket and a dog sitting still beside her. Lena snapped the blanket open hard. Silver flared in the sodium light with a brittle metallic crackle. The man flinched on instinct. Ranger launched low. He hit the gun wrist exactly where training had taught him to hit. He didn't aim for the throat or the face, but struck the wrist. His teeth locked, and the joint gave way. The pistol bucked sideways. Lena was already moving, sliding across damp concrete on one knee, one hand bracing, the other bringing up the scalpel. It was a number 11 blade, thin, triangular, and mean. The man's plate carrier protected the chest and left the underarm to chance. She drove the blade high under the armor lip and felt the point hit its mark. The target was neutralized quickly. Pressure loss there beat panic every time. The man's mouth opened, but his body shut down before he could react. His knees folded. Ranger stayed on the pinned wrist until Lena touched his flank. Release. The dog let go at once and backed half a step, silent, with his eyes still searching. Lena caught the falling pistol before it skated under a sedan. Warm slide. Oiled metal. One round missing if the accidental twitch came. Safety discipline said clear it. Time said no. She tucked it into the small of her back and knelt over the downed man while his body stopped moving. He had no wallet, no patch, cheap zip cuffs, a spare magazine, and an access badge with a fake maintenance logo. Then Lena found a rubberized PDA clipped inside the chest rig. She thumbed it awake, and the glow lit her glove blue-white. One line sat on the screen in clean corporate text. Asset sync required. Target viability required for sync. Lena read it twice. Asset viability. It wasn't ransom, and it wasn't random violence. Emma had been turned into a living key. Her jaw locked so hard it hurt. A second movement flickered deeper in the garage, too far back for a clean shot, little more than a shadow crossing shadow. Someone else was there, watching and waiting for the easy follow-up. The fallen man shifted on the floor, reflex only. A last blind signal through a body that had already lost the argument. His hand clenched. The suppressed pistol fired once into the open garage. Even with the can on it, the crack hit the concrete like a steel rod. Then the building answered. Relays snapped overhead. A klaxon coughed awake. Ranger's head came up before Lena turned, and when she did, the titanium shutter at the top of the ramp was already dropping. It came down fast, sparks spitting where steel scraped steel, heavy enough to shake dust from the beams. The exit vanished behind it, with one final slam that punched through the soles of her boots. Locked in, not because some villain felt dramatic, but because a gunshot in the wrong place had crossed a threshold and the system had done what systems did. Her phone vibrated in her pocket so hard it startled her more than the alarm. She yanked it free. Emma's monitor flashed red one last time. One ugly spike. One number she barely caught before it smeared in motion. Then the screen went black again. Dead feed. Dead signal. No glucose telemetry. No comfort. Just the cold reflection of her own face staring back at her from the glass. Lena pressed 2 fingers against the radial artery in her left wrist and counted 3 brutal beats before she made herself stop. Counting wasn't control. It only told her how fast she was running out of both. She pocketed the PDA, stripped the spare magazine from the body, and looked deeper into the dark where the second man had disappeared. Ranger sat beside her again without a sound, waiting. So was the rest of the garage. The shutter was still ringing in its rails when Lena found the service door beside the sealed ramp and pushed through with Ranger at her knee. The stairwell beyond felt like stepping into the throat of a machine. Sound changed first. There was no more broad echo rolling across open concrete, only tight metal returns, with each footstep thrown back at her from the steel stairs and painted walls. Then came the interference. It wasn't really a tone, not exactly, but a dry electrical pressure under the hearing, like static ground into bone. Lena had the phone out before the door latched behind them. She hit the secure number she swore she would never call again and watched the screen try, stall, and flatten into one sterile line. No signal. Military jammer active. Emma's glucose screen sat beneath it like a dead monitor in an ICU bay, showing a black field with no live number, no drift arrow, and no pulse hidden in the data. Apex had skinned the whole structure out of the air. No tower signal, no packet bleed, no help. Ranger moved one step down, then another, waiting for her to choose a direction. Lena planted the tips of her right index and middle finger against the radial artery in her left wrist. 130 or better. Too fast. She pulled her hand away and started down. The stairs were bare galvanized steel bolted into poured concrete, open-backed, and cold enough through her boots to bite. Ranger stayed tucked close on her blind side, his nails tapping once per step until even that sound annoyed her, and he adjusted, placing his paws with more care. Good dog. Good enough to know her breathing had gone shallow. Lena kept the recovered pistol low and close, with the muzzle angled off the rail, while the trauma kit knocked a steady rhythm against her hip. At the first landing, she stopped and listened. There were no voices and no fan noise, only the low insect rasp of the jammer somewhere deeper in the complex, and the dry sound of her own breath. The service door below wore a keypad and Maglock housing, matte gray, industrial, smug. On the far side of it, maybe Emma, maybe a team waiting on the funnel, maybe both. The PDA in her pocket felt heavier than it should have. Asset sync required. Target viability required for sync. She didn't need the screen lit up to remember the wording. Emma alive. Emma necessary. That bought time and made the trap smarter. Lena knelt at the hinge side, shrugged the kit around, and found the liquid nitrogen canister by touch. The metal cylinder was already frosting under her glove. Cold climbed into her palm, fast enough to feel hot. She thumbed the valve and pressed the nozzle into the lower hinge. White vapor exploded out with a sharp hiss and spilled across the floor in a crawling fog. The paint around the bracket darkened, then turned pale as the temperature dropped hard and fast. She counted under her breath, not looking at the phone now, and not looking at anything except the hinge and the tiny changes in its skin. 7, 8, 9, 10. Enough. She let the canister swing, grabbed the emergency hammer off the wall, and struck the hinge pin where metal met metal. The first hit rang. The second gave a brittle crack that didn't belong to healthy steel. She hit it again, and the hinge failed all at once, fragments skittering over the landing. The second hinge took less time. She applied the cold, held her count, and struck until the metal cracked and shattered. The door sagged inward on the lock side. Lena shoved with her shoulder, and the mag-locked panel tore free, with a dry scream of twisted brackets. The smell that came off it was paint dust, cold metal, and that dead clean scent cryogenics left behind when they flashed heat out of something faster than the material could think about it. The corridor beyond was narrower than she expected, with a low ceiling and green emergency strips throwing sick light along the baseboards. She took 2 steps in and froze for reasons that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with pattern. Something bright dusted the floor in front of the next door. Too fine for concrete dust. Too deliberate. Ranger saw it the same instant she did. He lowered his hindquarters and sat so abruptly the harness straps gave a soft leather creak. No bark, no growl. Just that rigid stillness he used when the ground itself was wrong. Lena dropped into a crouch and let her eyes settle. Silver powder lay thin across the threshold. Aluminum, a reveal, not debris. Her gaze followed the shine until it caught on a line so thin it barely existed, stretched through the dust and disappearing into the darkness at knee height. Fishing line, tripwire, C4. If Apex was feeling efficient, maybe more than 1 brick. She could almost see the geometry of it now, with the charge tucked behind the frame and the fragmentation path punching the hall into a danger zone. Behind the door, something shifted. A boot sole eased on concrete. Then, nothing. Men holding their breath and waiting for the next bad decision. Lena kept the pistol steady, but her mind had already moved past the gun to the wire, the dust, the volume of the hall, the shockwave, the dog, and the distance to cover if the line moved. Emma's screen stayed black in her pocket. No signal, no rescue, no room left for a mistake. Ranger remained seated, eyes locked on the threshold, while the shadow behind the door stood perfectly still and waited for her to try the obvious way in. The shadow behind the wired door held still. So did Lena. Ranger stayed seated, eyes nailed to the aluminum-dusted threshold. His body turned into one hard black line that meant the floor, the frame, and the air around it had all gone bad at once. Lena eased a pair of cutters out of the trauma kit and started mapping the geometry in her head. The trip line sat at knee height, with a likely secondary charge above hinge level, and the tight hall promised an ugly fragment path. She had just started shifting her weight for a lower angle when a speaker cracked overhead and a woman's voice poured down from the ceiling with no edge, no urgency, and no soul in it at all. Bio-Containment breach detected. Sector purge in T-10 seconds. Lena's eyes went up on reflex. Small aluminum vents sat flush along the corridor seam where wall met ceiling. She saw the camera too, a smoked dome she hadn't clocked because she'd been reading the wire and the powder and the men behind the door. Someone had seen enough. It wasn't a taunt. It was worse than that. It was procedure. The hidden shape on the other side of the door didn't move. Why would he? He didn't need to. The building had just joined the fight. At first, the gas came out as a dry, metallic hiss, almost delicate, a high-pressure whisper, turning savage by the second. Then, white vapor jetted from the vents and spread fast, too dense to be steam and too fine to be smoke. Ranger sneezed once and snapped his head aside. Lena held her breath, grabbed the dog by the harness, and backed off the line. Her free hand still had the cutters, but the corridor had changed math on her. The tripwire was still a threat. The gas was just quicker. Vapor rolled down the walls and folded into itself around her boots. It bit at the wet corners of her eyes first, then the skin under her jaw, then the soft lining inside her nose. She pivoted, looking for anything with a seal, an air curtain, a pressure lock, any stupid square room the system might keep cleaner than the hall. 3 doors behind her, 2 blank service panels, and 1 narrow lab entry with a swipe reader glowing amber. Ranger's gait had gone wrong already. His paws overreached half an inch and corrected late, like the floor had shifted under him. Lena yanked the cutters up to snip the dog loose from the line path if she had to drag him through a bad angle. Her hand betrayed her. The first trimmer hit so hard, the metal clacked sharply. The cutters slipped from her glove and bounced across the floor into the whitening vapor. She swore without sound, scooped for them, missed, and felt the second wave hit deeper. The gas was getting in through the eyes, through the wet skin at her wrists, maybe through the lungs. Despite the held breath she was trying to keep, her fingers went numb and hot at the same time. Peripheral shutdown, vessels pinching down hard. She abandoned the cutters and drove her shoulder into the lab door badge plate instead, dragging Ranger clear of the tripwire zone by brute force. The amber reader flashed, denied, then changed when the purge logic overrode local permissions. The lock opened heavily for half a second as the system started compartmentalizing. That was the only gift she got. Lena shoved the door with both hands. It stuck on the closer, then gave. Ranger stumbled through first, claws skating on smooth tile, and she followed him in under another blast of the white cloud. Something in the hallway doorframe caught the edge of her sleeve and ripped it. The lab was no bigger than a walk-in clinic procedure room. It had a stainless counter, glove boxes, a portable monitor asleep on a cart, and cold white lights too bright for the amount of air left inside her. Behind her, the corridor door slammed and sealed with a hydraulic bite that shook the glass panel beside it. A red strip blinked over the frame. Locked? Of course it was locked. Lena crossed half the room before her body started sending back the bill. Her chest spasmed for air she didn't want to waste. Ranger's ribs were pumping hard, faster than they should have been, with his nostrils flaring wide. Lena grabbed the edge of the counter to steady herself, and missed the first time. The room had started narrowing from the sides. Her vision tunneled, bright at the center and dark at the edges, like somebody was closing a fist around her skull. She checked Ranger first out of habit, and because he couldn't tell her numbers, pink tongue out, eyes watering. Not panicked yet, just poisoned. Good, or less bad. She forced herself to the cart and hit the monitor's wake key. The screen bloomed green and thin. Lead lines. SPO2 clip. EKG module. Her hands shook so hard she almost dropped the sensor before getting it onto her own finger. The reading lagged, then settled low and falling. Her pulse, which had been hammering in the stairwell, was doing something worse now. Slowing. Not calm. Failing. The gas had reached farther than she had. Her knees touched tile without her deciding to kneel. Ranger pressed into her side, searching for contact. The room looked dimmer every second, even though the lights hadn't changed. Lena reached for the crash drawer, knowing exactly what had to be in there and exactly how ugly this was about to get before the dark came all the way in. The monitor on the cart had a thin, nagging beep to it, small and impatient, like it had no idea how close she was to blacking out. Ranger's breathing rasped beside her. Dry. Fast. Too fast. Lena knelt one-handed on the tile and ripped the crash drawer open with the other. IV kits lay there in neat foam slots, bright plastic, clear tubing, all of it built for veins that still believed in cooperation. She tore one open anyway, ran the tourniquet high on the arm, tapped and slapped at the skin, and searched for anything that would rise. Nothing rose, nothing rolled. The vessels had cinched down to pale threads under skin gone waxy from the gas. She tried the back of her hand, then the crook of her elbow, then the other arm, and every site came back flat and empty. The pulse ox kept whining. Ranger leaned harder against her thigh, and the room swayed once, enough to warn her what came next if she kept pretending there was an easy fix. Side cabinet, airway tray, emergency meds, Then the hard case she needed. Black plastic, ugly in the bright lab light. EZIO. The thing looked less like medicine than a compact drill somebody had smuggled into a hospital. Fine. Honest tools usually looked rude. She tore the package with her teeth, snapped the needle assembly into place, and dragged her pant leg high enough to bare the top of her shin. She knew the landmark without thinking. Just below the knee, at the proximal tibia, where the surface was hard, the fat was thin, and the access stayed clean enough even with her hands shaking. The driver felt cold and mean in her grip. She planted the tip, checked the angle twice. Too shallow and it would skate. Too deep and she'd earn herself a slower kind of damage. The monitor chirped. Ranger shifted, then came back close. Lena put 2 fingers to her own wrist and found a pulse that had gone weak and thready, a bad little thread trying to pass for circulation. Enough. She squeezed the trigger. The drill whined and the needle bit. Then it punched through cortical bone with a dry crunch that shot up her leg and into her teeth. Pain hit white and full. It ran from shin to hip, across her ribs, straight behind her eyes. Her hand almost opened. Almost. She held on, jaw locked, breath shredded into pieces. For 1 filthy second, she heard nothing at all. Only the vibration living inside her skull. Then sound came back wrong. The monitor, Ranger's movement, her own ragged breathing. She pulled the stylet, locked the line, jammed the adrenaline syringe onto the hub, and drove the plunger down. The burn started deep. It wasn't skin. It wasn't muscle. It was marrow. The center of the bone flared hotly. Then it found her chest. Her heart kicked once, hard enough to fold her over. Then again. Then it took off. Fluid spilled from her nose in a hot rush and ran across her lip. Iron. Salt. Old pennies. Tachycardia came on violent and immediate, useful, in the same way a fire axe was useful if you didn't mind what else it broke on the way through. The room sharpened until it hurt. Stainless edges flashed too bright. The sink looked suddenly near enough to headbutt. The monitor's beeping turned frantic, or her hearing turned cheap. One ear muffled, then the other. Wet wool packed into the world. She swallowed hard, spat onto the tile, and got a boot under her. The injured leg buckled at once. Not weakness, structural damage. The leg flared with pain when she loaded it and kept flaring when she did it again. Good. Let it. Pain still meant the line had bought her time. She ripped the needle free, dressed the site with fast, ugly hands, and looked at Ranger. The dog was standing, but not well. Glassy eyes, wet nose, breathing too hard. A small oxygen cylinder sat clipped under the counter. She dragged it free, found an emergency mask, and laughed once through the haze because the mask was made for a human face, not a Malinois muzzle. Didn't matter. She slapped it over Ranger's snout, ran the strap behind his head, and wound black electrical tape around the whole mess until it held. The dog hated it. He shook once, started to paw at it, and stopped when the oxygen hissed through. Lena used the same cylinder for one quick pull of clean air against her own mouth, then gave it back to him. No speeches, just triage. The extra oxygen gave her maybe half a minute where the room stopped pitching. She spent it on the door. A stainless rolling cart became a battering ram. She locked both hands on the frame and drove it into the sealed panel, once, twice, 3 times. Every impact sent a bolt of pain through the tibia, so fierce it nearly folded her. The latch plate tore loose on the 4th hit. She backed up, planted on the good leg, and kicked with the bad one anyway, because there was no clean option left. The lock gave way. The door slammed outward into the corridor wall. Sound came back in a dirty rush, even through the muffled hearing. Boots, filter, hiss, the crackle of Tyvek. 4 hazmat figures had already turned toward the breach, black faceplates up, weapons raised, patient as accountants about to close a file. Their first movement wasn't panic. It was spacing. Lena raised the pistol and leaned into the leg she could no longer trust, while Ranger came through the doorway with the taped mask still strapped to his face. One leg ruined, heart sprinting, ears half dead, 4 guns waiting in the hall. Good enough. The first shot hit Lena high in the ribs and felt wrong. It was not the sharp punch of a live round trying to tear through tissue. This was blunt, heavy, like a brick wrapped in wet canvas. She staggered into the ruined lab doorway, breath leaving her in a hard grunt, and understood before the pain finished blooming. Beanbag. Less penetration. More shock. Capture ammunition. The 4 hazmat figures in the corridor kept their spacing, with White Tyvek whispering every time one of them shifted a boot. Their masks hid their faces, but the muzzle discipline said enough. They were not here to kill her clean. They were here to fold her, restrain her, and keep her breathing for whoever had decided Emma needed to stay viable. Ranger lunged low, with the taped oxygen mask still strapped over his muzzle, and one of the men flinched back hard enough to lose his lane. Another beanbag slammed past Lena's shoulder and broke apart against a cabinet behind her. Plastic burst. Clear fluid sheeted across the floor and ran into the corridor in shallow fingers. Her injured tibia screamed when she put weight on it. Warmth from her nose coated her mouth again. Fine. Pain was information. Information meant options. She saw the wall-mounted defibrillator 10 feet down the corridor and felt the next move lock into place. She fired no rounds. That rule held. Instead, she backed off crooked, favoring the good leg, with the pistol up only to keep them cautious, while her free hand shoved the rolling stainless cart into the hall. It rattled across tile and forced the fire team to widen. One of them fired again. The beanbag struck the cart and dropped with a thick rubbery knock. That was confirmation. It was not lethal ammunition, and it was not meant to end here tonight. Lena ducked, ripped the defibrillator from its wall bracket, and nearly folded when the motion sent a bright bolt of pain through her shin. The cable packs came free with it, coiled and stubborn. She stripped one paddle loose, then the other, while Ranger worried the nearest gunman from below, snapping at his ankle and darting away before the muzzle could track him down. Good dog. Keep them busy. Keep them stupid. The spill on the floor had spread farther than she'd hoped, a wash of saline and process fluid creeping around boot soles. One hazmat man stepped into it and checked himself too late, sole slipping. Another crossed to keep angle and planted beside him. Lena clipped one lead to the steel frame of the bent lab door and jammed the other against a metal support rail. Her thumb hit the charge button. Rising tone. Mechanical. Clean. The men heard it and hesitated, but hesitation is just delayed bad luck when you're already standing in conductive sludge. She hit the shock control, and the corridor snapped bright. 360 joules punched through water, steel, and bodies in one vicious burst. The 2 men in the spill convulsed as if every tendon in them had been yanked at once. One slammed backward into the wall so hard his mask cracked. The other jerked upright, weapon flying from his grip before he collapsed in a heap that twitched once and went still. The smell came a heartbeat later. Ozone first, sharp and metallic, then scorched fabric, then the thick scent of insulation and gear cooking under soaked Kevlar. Even through her muffled hearing, Lena caught the heavy sound their bodies made hitting the floor. For one short beat, the corridor seemed to pull in on itself. Her ears rang. The burned smell thickened. Ranger's nails tapped once on the tile as he changed direction. Then, the last 2 operators finally lost discipline. One stumbled sideways, muzzle hunting, for Ranger. The other saw the downed pair, saw the paddles in Lena's hand, and panicked into volume. He emptied a burst of beanbags without aiming. Rounds, slamming walls, door frame, ceiling fixtures, and the rolling cart. One hit Lena's forearm numb. Another shattered a light strip over her head. Ranger shot across the hall and clipped the man's calf, not to maul, just enough to tear his balance out from under him. The other operator fired too, blind and quick, just another body trying to force panic through a gun. The burst walked upward. One impact hit the overhead line with a sharp metallic bang. Then another. Then the pressurized pipe split along its seam. What came out was not water. A furious hiss filled the corridor as vapor blasted from the break and rolled along the ceiling before spilling down in white curtains. The smell hit Lena at once, hot, cold, and chemical, raw enough to make her eyes sting through the residue of the purge gas. Isopropanol. Dense, sterile, and wrong. The surviving gunman skidded back into it, coughing inside his mask, and fired wild. More shots punched concrete and wall, none of them finding her. The fog thickened fast, swallowing the far end of the corridor and turning the green emergency strips into weak underwater smears. Ranger came back to her limping but upright, mask askew and tape fluttering at one edge. Lena dropped the dead paddles, grabbed his harness, and pulled both of them down behind the overturned cart, while the white cloud poured from the ruptured line and spread around the bodies on the floor. 2 men down from current, 2 still moving somewhere inside the haze. A corridor now slick, half-blind, and filling with something far worse than either side had planned for. Good enough. The corridor vanished by layers. First the far wall, then the bodies, then the green emergency strips along the baseboards, reduced to weak smears under a rolling white flood that looked almost clean until it hit the back of Lena's throat. Isopropanol, not steam, not coolant. Alcohol carried in pressure and atomized fine enough to turn the air itself hostile. It stripped moisture from her eyes and made the inside of her nose feel flayed raw. The hiss above them was relentless, a hard industrial scream from the ruptured line, and the fog came down thick enough to flatten distance. Ranger pressed into her leg and sneezed twice behind the taped mask. The 2 surviving hazmat men were still in there somewhere, pale ghosts moving through their own weather. Their masks kept them alive, but the faceplates stole depth and range. Tunnel vision. Lena saw it in the way one silhouette swept his weapon across empty air, while the other clipped a shoulder on the wall he hadn't realized was that close. Their breathing systems hissed louder every time they turned. Panic makes people noisy. So does false confidence. Lena wiped moisture from under her nose with the back of her wrist and tasted alcohol in it. Her injured leg throbbed with every heartbeat, and her heartbeat was still sprinting like it had somewhere useful to be. She crouched behind the overturned cart and took inventory by touch. She had the pistol at her back, 1 extra magazine, and a trauma kit half emptied. A small oxygen cylinder was clipped to the side webbing, the same one she'd stolen seconds from in the lab. The white cloud folded around the steel frame and dragged cold across her knuckles. One of the masked men fired into the fog, beanbags smacking the wall behind her with deep, stupid thuds. He still thought force would solve this if he threw enough of it into the dark. Lena rose just high enough to watch the muzzle pattern. Both operators were advancing by memory now, not sight. Their masks protected them and made them clumsy. They moved like divers in dirty water, overcorrecting every step. One nearly tripped on a body and recovered with a curse swallowed by the respirator. The other pivoted toward the sound instead of the threat. Good. The oxygen bottle felt suddenly heavier in her hand, its shape fitting the shape of the corridor, the fog, the steel, and the pulse hammering in her ears. She did not think in textbook chemistry. She thought only of fuel, an oxidizer, and a spark. Enough to break the line, not enough to bury the whole structure. She cracked the valve and heard the hard whisper of clean oxygen spilling into contaminated air. Then she waited until the 2 men drifted close enough together to make the risk worth it. She came up hard and ugly, not graceful, just fast enough. The cylinder sailed low through the fog, spinning end over end, trailing a thin hiss. One hazmat operator saw it too late and flinched the wrong way, colliding with the other. Their silhouettes tangled. Lena pulled the pistol, braced it two-handed despite the tremor in her forearm, and aimed not at a chest or a head, but at the polished stone floor in front of them. The shot cracked through the hallway, louder than it should have. The round hit at a bad angle and shaved along the stone hard enough to throw a bright fan of sparks. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the corridor inhaled. Fire rolled through the suspended alcohol in a flat, rushing bloom. Not a giant movie fireball, just a brutal expansion of heat and pressure that turned the air into a hammer. The shock wave slammed into Lena and the cart together. Her ears, already damaged, went from muffled to near silent in one savage blink. The two operators caught the worst of it in the open. One was thrown backward into the wall, arms and weapon flung wide. The other dropped as if his strings had been cut. Mask ripped sideways, body collapsing on the floor. The oxygen bottle became movement and force, ricocheting down the hall, while fire flashed and died as fast as it had come. The overpressure knocked one of the heavy interior doors off its latch farther down the corridor. Lena saw it through the thinning fog as a black titanium slab jerking free and slamming inward against some unseen frame. The hiss from the ruptured pipe dropped a notch. No longer the only sound in the world. Ceiling dust drifted through the alcohol mist. A body shifted. Another didn't. Ranger crouched low, stunned but still with her. The taped mask half torn free now, sides pumping. Lena pushed herself upright on the bad leg and almost went back down. The tibia answered with a bright spear of pain that ran to her ribs. But the door at the far end was open, and that mattered more than the bone. She limped forward through the wreckage, stepping over a dropped shotgun, over a blackened glove, and over the sprawled shape nearest the wall. She did not waste a round, did not waste a look. The hall beyond the blasted door ran darker and deeper, stripped of the green safety glow, and somewhere ahead of that darkness sat Zone 4 and Emma and the next layer of the machine. Ranger came with her, stumbling once, then correcting. Lena touched the dog's shoulder in passing, more count than comfort, and crossed through the broken titanium doorway into the core of the facility, while the last of the white fog curled and faded behind them. The corridor beyond the blasted titanium door felt different at once. The air was colder, scrubbed harder, and carried a deep mechanical thrum that never quite became sound so much as pressure in the teeth. Ranger limped beside Lena, with the tape-strapped mask hanging crooked over his muzzle, still helping, but no longer sealing clean. Her own breath sounded wrong in her head, too close and too thin, a private rasp trapped behind damaged hearing. Warm moisture kept slipping across her lip. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist and kept moving. The hall narrowed, then bent, then opened onto a glass-fronted section washed in sick green light. Somewhere inside the walls, turbines were dragging air through the place with relentless purpose. Vacuum discipline. Negative pressure. Nothing in there escaped unless the system allowed it. Lena saw the red distance stripe on the floor before she understood why it had been painted there. 30 feet, maybe a little less. The moment her boot crossed it, her phone screamed, not buzzed, not chimed, screamed. A shrill alarm tore through the wool-packed ruin of her hearing and made even Ranger flinch sideways. The screen was suddenly alive in her hand, with Bluetooth reconnected and data flooding back in one cruel burst. 45 mgdl. Critical hypoglycemia. She stopped dead and stared through the reinforced glass. Emma sat strapped to a steel chair under green-white light, with her wrists bound and her head pitching forward for 1 second, and then jerking up again in small, involuntary corrections. Pale skin, cold sweat across the temple and upper lip, fine muscle tremors skating through the jaw, shoulders, and thighs. Not panic, biology. The girl's body was burning through the last clean margin before seizure or collapse. Lena read it in one fast sweep, the way she used to read monitor strips under mortar fire, assessing skin tone, breathing depth, and the delay in eye tracking. The sweat mattered. The tremor mattered more. Emma was still in the fight, but not for long. Behind her stood a man in dark tactical layers, stripped of ornament, with no swagger and no dramatic pacing, just stillness built around control. Commander Voss. He held a steel-cased drive in one hand, compact and ugly, with a biometric slot set along the spine like a waiting mouth. No laptop, no cable, just the drive and a chair-bound diabetic teenager whose glucose was falling through the floor. Asset sync required. Target viability required for sync. The PDA line from the garage clicked into place with the scene in front of her. Emma was not leverage. She was the lock. Her pulse, her vascular pattern, her being alive at the exact right threshold. That was why the beanbags had flown. That was why the fire teams had closed, instead of killing. Lena leaned one hand against the glass and forced herself to catalog, not react. Ranger's breathing, her own balance, the distance to the door, the position of Voss's sidearm, the geometry of the room beyond him. Emma saw her then. Even through the sweat and tremor and glucose crash, she saw her. Her eyes widened once, then steadied. Good kid. Smart enough not to waste movement. Voss followed the girl's gaze and turned his head. No surprise on his face. No speech. Just recognition, quick and exact, followed by the slight narrowing of a man whose schedule had just developed a leak. He looked at Lena, then at the phone in her hand, then at Emma's numbers reflected red in the glass. His grip on the drive shifted by less than an inch. Contract math, recalculating. He took a radio from his chest rig and pressed the transmit key without raising his voice. Flood the outer corridor with the gas. Don't let her live. That was it. No threat, no flourish, just another line item moved from pending to execution. A second later, the hall around Lena answered him. Somewhere overhead, valves opened. Aluminum vents hidden along the corridor seams woke with a metallic click. Ranger coughed behind the tape and planted himself harder against her leg. Emma jerked once against the restraints as another wave of tremor hit her. Voss did not move toward the door. He still needed the girl breathing, needed the numbers in her blood and the rhythm in her arteries. The first hiss of the new gas came from the corridor ceiling, dry and high, sharp enough to scrape. Lena stepped back from the glass and dragged Ranger with her. The phone kept shrieking, 45 meters GDL, in ugly red pulses that made the green light look diseased. Emma's chest was moving too fast. Her skin had gone beyond pale, into that drained, waxy color Lena hated most. She measured the remaining time by symptoms, not hope. Minutes, maybe. Less if seizure started. Voss watched from inside the room, the kind of man who let systems do the ugly work, while he protected the asset that mattered. His eyes flicked once to the drive, once to Emma, once back to Lena. There it was again. Calculation, not hatred, not fear. Cost. That was the seam. Gas began to spill from the vents in ghostly ribbons, turning the outer corridor into a white-edged throat. Ranger sneezed, then coughed. Lena pulled him lower and backed toward the frame, keeping Voss in sight through the gathering haze. Emma's fingers twitched against the arm of the chair. One tiny movement. Not random. Signal still possible. Good. If the girl still had enough control left to send a message, this was not over. Lena looked at the alarm on her phone, then at the drive in Voss's hand, then at the man himself, who had built his confidence on one central fact. Emma had to stay alive. So that became the point of entry. Not the gun, not the glass. The contract. Gas feathered down from the corridor vents and found every wet place on Lena's face. The cuts inside her nose, the corners of her eyes, the split in her lower lip where she'd bitten through it during the drill. Ranger pressed against her calf and coughed once into the taped mask. Through the reinforced glass, Emma was sliding lower in the chair, not unconscious yet and not gone, but close enough for the body to start choosing survival over dignity. Then Lena saw it. The girl's right index finger lifted off her thigh and tapped once. Then again, then a third time. Weak, uneven, deliberate. 3 taps. Emma's old field signal. I'm still here. I still understand. Good. That was enough. Lena shoved one hand into the trauma kit and found the syringe she'd loaded earlier with saline for flushing lines. The Humalog label still wrapped the barrel. Clean print. Real enough at a glance. She held it up where Voss could see it through the haze and the glass. His attention shifted at once. Not dramatic, just precise. First the syringe, then Emma's shaking body, then the drive in his own hand, as if each object had to be checked against the others to keep the equation from collapsing. Lena stepped closer to the door, limping hard now, hearing half-shot, and lifted the syringe higher. I hit her with Humalog, she said, voice raw but steady enough to carry through the intercom slit. Heart stops in 60 seconds. The drive formats itself. Hand over the glucose. Emma did not look at her. Good again. The child kept her eyes down and let the trimmer do the acting. Voss did not answer right away. He looked at his chronometer instead. That mattered. A man lying to himself watches faces. A man pricing disaster watches the clock. His gaze moved from the ticking seconds on his wrist to the sweat across Emma's face, to the involuntary shake in her thighs, then back to the syringe. Hypoglycemia already mimicked the surface signs of insulin overdose, closely enough to punish caution. Lena could see the arithmetic landing behind his eyes in cold, clean rows. A muscle jumped once along his jaw. He blinked too hard. Once. And the expression was gone again. If Emma crashed completely, the vascular rhythm changed. If the rhythm changed, the synchronization could fail. If the sync failed, the drive became financially radioactive to whoever had signed Apex's contract. He wasn't weighing a child's life. He was weighing penalties, breach clauses, reputation loss, and the cost of delivering damaged goods to people rich enough to kill over inconvenience. The gas hissed louder around Lena's shoulders. Ranger pawed once at the tile, then froze when she touched the back of his neck. Emma's finger tapped again. Once. A drag of nail this time. Less control. Time was real. That, at least, Lena did not need to fake. Voss stepped closer to Emma, not to comfort her, just to study the signs at point-blank range. Her skin shone wet under the green cast of the room. Tiny tremors moved through one cheek. Her breathing had gone shallow and fast. All true, all useful. He looked back at Lena and finally spoke, his voice carrying no heat at all. What sight? Not because he cared, because detail was cost control. Lena gave him one without hesitation. Thigh. Close enough to sound ugly. Simple enough to feel probable. She let her hand shake around the syringe. Not performative. Just not hidden. Outside the room, the corridor gas thickened into a pale wall. Her head had started swimming again. Ranger's taped mask fluttered with each breath. Voss checked the chronometer a second time. His thumb shifted over the access card in his other hand. He still held the steel case drive tucked against his palm like a banker protecting a passport. Good. Protect the asset. Protect the asset. Lena did not have to teach him his own religion. She only had to let him kneel to it. Emma made a tiny sound in her throat, more air than voice, and her shoulder jerked against the restraint. Voss's nostrils flared once behind the mask, and the tendons at the hinge of his jaw stood out before he forced them flat again. That did it. He reached to a side tray, picked up a preloaded glucose syringe, and kept his pistol in the other hand. Even now, cornered by math, he refused to give up all his options at once. Reasonable man. Dangerous man. The card touched the reader beside the negative pressure door. The lock answered with a heavy internal clunk that sounded almost ceremonial under the turbine hum buried in the walls. The seal broke slowly. That was the worst part. Not the noise. The patience. Hinges under pressure did not swing. They yielded. The door eased inward by inches, a tight mechanical parting that let cold, sterile air slip through in a narrow stream. Voss stayed just inside the threshold, gun low but ready, glucose syringe extended in his other hand like a concession he intended to invoice later. The drive remained tucked against his wrist. He still did not trust the opening. He was right not to. Lena lowered her own syringe by half an inch and leaned into the limp she no longer had to fake. Her pulse was still hammering too fast from the adrenaline, but the rest of her had gone remote, stripped down to angle, timing, and pain. Ranger crouched near her bad leg, mask half loose, body coiled, despite the coughing. Emma's eyes lifted again, found her mother through the narrowing seam, and held there. Voss glanced at his chronometer one more time. Tiny movement, automatic, fatal, sooner or later. He was still counting contract seconds while the room around him turned into a trap. The door opened another few inches, enough space for an arm, enough space for a mistake. The hinges gave a long, low metallic complaint as the seal loosened further, and the sound slid through the corridor like a blade being drawn from bone. The seal opened another inch, enough for air to change, enough for Ranger. He moved before Voss finished his next glance at the chronometer, a black streak off Lena's ruined side, fast and low and silent, until impact. He did not go for the wrist, throat, or gun. He went for the breathing rig, jaws closing on the intake tube and filter housing at the side of Voss's mask. Plastic popped, rubber tore. Voss jerked backward, one hand snapping up too late to protect the mask, the other still holding the glucose syringe. Cold white gas from the outer corridor rolled through the widening seam and kissed the torn filter before he could turn away. He inhaled reflexively and paid for it at once. His shoulders hitched. His stance widened. The gun dipped. Lena was already moving. The limp did not vanish. It became geometry. One hard drive off the good leg, one dragging step from the bad, and one shoulder through the opening before the door could narrow again. Emma's chair was lighter than it looked because the girl inside it had already burned too much of herself. Lena seized a fistful of jacket at the collarbone and hauled hard metal legs, shrieking across the floor. Emma cried out once through clenched teeth, real voice, good, conscious. Ranger dropped clean at Lena's command. The room beyond the threshold was colder than the corridor and cleaner in the worst way. Green pressure readouts crawled across one wall, stainless counters, sealed cabinets, one heavy turbine note under everything. The low, endless pull of a system built to value contamination control over bodies. Emma's knees buckled under the restraints, useless for helping. Lena did not waste time freeing them yet. She yanked the chair backward until one leg caught on the threshold lip, then shoved again. The steel frame bounced over, and the rear wheels left the room. Voss recovered enough to bring the pistol up, but not enough to aim before Ranger hit him again, this time at the chest and shoulder. Not biting deep, just turning the man's balance wrong. That was enough. Lena let go of Emma for 1 second, drove both hands into Voss's sternum, and used his stumble to send him reeling deeper into the chamber. He slammed against the inner glass hard enough to smear a handprint there. The glucose syringe spun away. The gun stayed in his grip, but loose now, occupied by air hunger and failing filter flow. Lena backed out with Emma's chair halfway through the doorway, and her own bad leg screaming from shin to hip. The seal wanted to close. She could feel the motor resistance in the frame. Then she saw the red glass box on the corridor wall. Biohazard Purge. Not a hero switch, just one more ugly part of a system, built to prefer machinery to judgment. She hit the cabinet with a steel tray first and cracked nothing. Fine. She hit it with her fist next, bone first, and the glass burst inward with a bright, brittle crash. A red toggle sat exposed under the shards. Lena slammed it down. For half a beat, nothing happened except the throb in her hand and the bite of gas at the back of her throat. Then the chamber voice came alive overhead. female, and perfectly indifferent. Biological contamination detected in negative pressure chamber. Ceiling locks engaged. Initiating total atmosphere vacuum. Voss understood before Emma did, before Ranger did, before even the corridor lights changed from green to pulsing amber red. He lunged for the threshold, mask hanging open at one side, gun finally abandoned to the floor as both hands went to the narrowing seam. Lena did not shoot, did not need to. She hauled Emma's chair fully clear and kicked the wheel frame sideways so it jammed against the outer corridor wall instead of the closing door. Titanium bolts drove home inside the chamber frame with heavy hydraulic thunks. The door caught Voss's forearm for a fraction of a second, forced him back, then completed its lock with a sound Lena felt through her boots. Ranger stayed low beside Emma, mask slipping askew again, growling now in small exhausted bursts. The turbine note changed, rose, deepened, became a pull strong enough to tug gauze and paper toward the base vents. Voss hit the glass with both palms and shouted something Lena could not hear through the wreck of her hearing. And the thick pain between them, he pounded again. Again, the torn filter on his mask fluttered uselessly at his cheek. Air vanished in stages. Bodies always told the truth when systems lied. First, Voss's breathing sped up, huge, useless chest lifts chasing oxygen, already leaving the room faster than he could pull it in. Then his mouth opened wider behind the torn mask. His neck cord stood out. Condensation flashed on the inside of the glass and vanished as the pressure changed. The turbine howl climbed to a mechanical scream. Emma slumped in the chair beside Lena, trembling hard enough to chatter the frame. Lena dropped to one knee, tore the glucose syringe from the floor where it had skidded, ripped open the thigh access with one savage pull, and drove rescue back into her daughter, while Voss hammered the glass with one hand and clawed the ruined mask with the other. No sermon, no final line, no bargain left to offer. His movements lost force by degrees, became jerks instead of strikes, then drags. He slid one palm down the pane and left a smeared wet print there. The turbine kept taking. That was the point. EPA logic. Pure procedure. Sterile murder by protocol. Lena held pressure on Emma's leg, counted breaths, watched sweat bead and run from the girl's hairline, and only looked up once when the pounding stopped. Voss was still on the other side of the glass, but the system had already finished the part that mattered. Ranger sat against Lena's hip, sides pumping, eyes fixed on the sealed chamber, while the red lights kept pulsing. 72 hours later, the kitchen light was yellow and ordinary, and too soft for the things Lena remembered in flashes. Not memories with neat borders, just impact. Emma on cold concrete under dock lights, skin slick with sweat, lips going gray at the edges while sirens stacked somewhere beyond the warehouses. Lena kneeling in chemical residue, hands still shaking hard enough to make the glucose syringe rattle before she buried it in her daughter's thigh and drove the rescue home. Ranger down on his sternum beside them, too tired to stand guard properly, doing it anyway. The gene drive had felt heavier than its size justified. She had smashed it with the butt of a pistol until the casing split and the internals turned to glittering ruin across the dock. No ceremony, no chain of custody, just destruction before somebody with a warrant and a flag pin could reclassify the nightmare into an asset. EPA and FBI. Lights washed the shipping containers blue and red after that. No military convoy, no helicopter with a general stepping out into rotor wash to clap her on the shoulder. Only federal jackets, respirators, perimeter tape, and men with clipboards looking at the chemical spill before they looked at the people. Systems always counted contamination before gratitude. Now the same kind of system murmured from the television above her refrigerator, flattening disaster into headlines. The anchor's voice was clean and forgettable. Apex Logistics CEO arrested after federal environmental violations. Biohazard negligence. Hazardous disposal. pending conspiracy charges. Stock plunge, regulatory inquiry. Nothing about a teenage girl tied to a chair in a pressure chamber. Nothing about mercenaries in Tyvek suits or a K9 coughing through a taped oxygen mask. Nothing about a mother drilling her own tibia just to buy enough minutes to keep moving. The report cut to aerial footage of the facility and then to a podium statement from an EPA spokesman who looked relieved to be talking about solvent contamination instead of what the contamination had been used for. Emma sat at the kitchen table under that voice, healthier now, but still thinner than she should have been, flicking bits of turkey from her sandwich toward Ranger with the lazy confidence of somebody who had survived long enough to get rude again. Ranger caught one piece, missed the next, and stared at the floor for a second before taking the loss back. His right ear never moved. The left twitched at every scrap wrapper and chair leg knock. Emma laughed once, low and real, and the sound hit Lena harder than the television ever could. She kept one hand on the counter while she watched them and pretended it was habit instead of balance. Her right leg had stiffened while she stood. The old dull line of pain was there already, waiting for weight. The envelope had arrived with the noon mail. Heavy stock, federal watermark, visible only when she turned it against the window. No return office listed in plain print. Just a barcode, a classification stamp, and one line across the face in restrained red letters. Classified, restrictive action. It sat on the counter unopened for 11 full minutes, while she finished dressing the abrasion on Ranger's foreleg and checked Emma's post-meal number twice without needing to. Delay changed nothing. She slid it with a paring knife and unfolded the letter under the range hood light. Medical Board, Federal Coordination, National Security Exposure, Permanent Revocation of Emergency and Surgical Licensure pending sealed findings. The language was dry enough to preserve flowers. No accusation she could argue with in daylight. No named accuser. No courtroom. No number to call where a human voice might sound sorry. Just the bureaucratic version of a closed casket. She read it once, then again more slowly, not because she had missed the meaning, but because training made her verify even the wounds she already felt. Ranger came over and rested his chin against her thigh, as if he had chosen the wrong leg on purpose. Emma looked up from the table and saw the paper in Lena's hand. She did not ask what it said. She knew enough by the shape of her mother's face and the stillness that came over a room when another door had just locked somewhere out of sight. On the television, a legal analyst was explaining market fallout, penalties, exposure, corrective oversight. Language close enough to Voss's world to make Lena want to put her fist through the screen. She did not. Systems had already taken their bite. Instead, she folded the letter back along its original crease, precise, controlled, the way field dressings were folded before they got bloody. Emma tossed one last scrap of turkey, and Ranger caught it clean this time, tail tapping twice against the wood floor, not wagging hard, just counting joy in a way his body could afford. Lena pushed away from the counter and tried to cross the kitchen without bracing. The first full transfer of weight onto the right leg lit the old drill track like a fuse. Pain flashed from the tibia straight up through the knee, into the hip, and then behind her eyes with a speed that made the room sharpen around the edges. She stopped, let the breath go out through her nose, and took the next step shorter. There it was, the permanent answer, not dramatic enough for pity, too real to ignore, a limp small enough to miss if you loved her, obvious enough to spot if you were looking for weakness. She reached the sink, set the folded letter beside the drying rack, and listened, television low, refrigerator hum, Emma chewing, Ranger's tail knocking wood in patient uneven beats. 2 heart rhythms in the house now steady, where one of them had nearly vanished. That was not healing. It was inventory. It was what remained after procedure, penalty, and survival finished negotiating. Lena looked at her daughter, looked at the dog, and let her hand rest for 1 second against the scarred line below her knee, before taking it away again. Nothing about the movement was sentimental. It was acknowledgement. The cost had settled in. It lived here now. So did they.